Hello everyone and welcome to CT Talks with Premier Brains. For today's episode of knowledge sharing Q&A sessions on UAE corporate tax, with the topic of discussion would be the taxation of the non-resident person. On 9th October 2023, the Federal Tax Authority released the Non-Resident Persons Corporate Tax Guide that provides general guidance to juridical or natural persons who are non-residents and if they would be subject to the UAE corporate tax. So, let's begin with the first basic question for today's concept. So, who are considered non-resident persons for UAE corporate tax?
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Asher, for this question. So first, to understand who is a non-resident person, we have to see who is a resident person under UAE corporate tax. So a resident natural person is someone who conducts business or business activity in the UAE. And a juridical person would be considered as a non-resident or basically a resident person if it is incorporated or established in the UAE or if it is established outside the UAE but effectively managed or controlled from the UAE. So in effect, we can say a non-resident is someone who has a fixed place of business or any other form of presence in the UAE or derives UAE-sourced income or even have a nexus in the UAE. But in the case of natural person, if someone has a turnover attributable to the permanent establishment in the UAE, which exceeds more than 1 million in a calendar year, would be considered as a non-resident for corporate tax purposes.
Okay. So, what is meant by having a nexus in UAE?
So having a nexus for a juridical non-resident person, this concept basically applies only to juridical non-resident persons and not natural persons. So it means deriving income from an immovable property in the UAE. So income can be by way of sale, disposal, assignment, leasing, or a subleasing or any other form of exploitation of the immovable property. So non-resident juridical person who have a nexus in the UAE are required to register for corporate tax. Okay. In fact, there has to be a careful consideration to check if a nexus would attract or not. So for example, if there is any equipment which is installed and permanently attached to the building, this can also take the form of a nexus. And further, someone would need to check if a PE would be triggered if a business is carried on a regular basis from that place.
Okay. So, when is a non-resident person required to register for corporate tax?
Okay, so a juridical non-resident person will be required to register for corporate tax if they trigger a permanent establishment in the UAE or they have a nexus in the UAE. And a natural non-resident person will be required to register if they have a turnover which is attributable to the permanent establishment in the UAE exceeding 1 million dirhams in a 12-month period. So in both of these cases, they will be required to register for corporate tax. However, if they do not have any, if the juridical non-resident person does not have a PE or does not have any nexus but only derives state-sourced income, they will not be required to register for corporate tax. So UAE-sourced income, which is attributable to a permanent establishment in the UAE, would be subject to corporate tax. And if a state-sourced income is not related to a PE, then it would not be subject to corporate tax. Basically, but may be subject to withholding tax, which is currently specified as 0% in the law. So let me talk here a little bit more about the taxation rates for non-resident person. So non-resident person would be subject to regular corporate tax rate, which is 0% for profits up to 375,000 dirhams and 9% for profits above 375,000 dirhams. However, in case the non-resident person is a qualifying free zone person, then they would be subject to special rates, which is applicable for free zones, that is 0% on the qualifying income and 9% on the income which is not a qualifying income.
Okay. So, which income is exempt for corporate tax for non-residents?
So there is an exemption which is provided in the corporate tax law, which says that any income which is derived from the operation of ships or aircraft in international transportation. So if they conduct activities such as international transport of passengers, livestock, mail, or any merchandise by way of air or sea, or any leasing or chartering of aircraft or ships, or any leasing of equipments which are an important part of the seaworthiness or airworthiness of those ships or vessels, then those activities can qualify for the exemption. An important point here to note is that this exemption will only be applicable if a reciprocal exemption is given to a UAE resident person in the country where the non-resident person is a resident. So basically, in the country of the non-resident, if that country also offers a similar exemption to UAE resident person, then this exemption under UAE corporate tax will also apply to the non-residents.
Okay. So now we come to the permanent establishment. So how is the permanent establishment determined, and what are the different forms of permanent establishment?
So generally speaking, when we say permanent establishment, it means creating a stable base or presence outside the home country. So if an entity has, basically it creates a taxable presence outside the home territory of the non-resident person. So we can say that, a non-resident person in UAE can attract PE if it conducts business or business activity in the UAE through a fixed or permanent place, or if there is a person which habitually exercises authority to conduct business or business activity on behalf of the non-resident person. So PE can take two forms as per the UAE corporate tax law. It can be a fixed place PE or it can be a agency PE. So when we talk about fixed place PE, it's actually a place of business which is used to conduct business or business activity, which is like a fixed or a permanent place of business in the UAE. And when we say agency PE, if someone does not have a fixed place, but there is an agent who conducts business or business activity on a regular basis on behalf of the non-resident person, then that can be considered as an agency PE. An important point to note here is that that person should be legally or economically, should not be legally or economically independent from the non-resident person. So here we are kind of saying it should be a dependent agent PE.
What are the essential factors for determining a fixed place permanent establishment, and what are the specific inclusions related to it?
So there are various factors which need to be looked at to determine whether a fixed place permanent establishment exists or not. And these tests needs to be satisfied on a case-to-case basis. But before I go into that, I would like to mention that when we are considering whether a permanent establishment is triggered or not, we also need to look at the double taxation avoidance agreement between UAE and the country of the non-resident person to see whether that would also trigger a PE or not. So these things also need to be kept into consideration. Now coming back to the tests which need to be satisfied for a fixed place permanent establishment, there are basically 4 tests. The first one basically it is a place of business test. So non-resident person should have a place of business through which the activity is carried out in the UAE. So this place can be an office or any work premises or any location or even any machinery and equipment through which the business is carried on a regular basis. The second test which we look at is the permanence test. When we say a fixed place, so there has to be a certain degree of permanence attached to it. Usually what we can say is that if there is an aggregate period of 6 months in a 12-month period, then that can typically indicate permanence. So this is a permanence test. Another test which we need to look at is at the disposal test. So that place of business which the non-resident has, the non-resident should have a right of effective use of that place, and it should be at the disposal of the non-resident person. Just a mere presence of the place would not indicate, that it is at his disposal. So let me give you an example here. So for example, there is a non-resident company which is undertaking a project, long-term project in UAE, for which it sends its employees in the UAE. The employees stay in hotel premises and they carry out the project work through that hotel premises. So effectively, that hotel premises are at the disposal of the employees of the non-resident person, through which they are carrying out the project, which is the activity for the non-resident person in UAE. So that can trigger a permanent establishment in the UAE. The last test is basically the business activity test. So when we say that through the fixed place business or business activity must be conducted, which should be the core income generating activities of the non-resident, and not just any activity which is preparatory or auxiliary in nature. And I think you asked about the specific inclusions also of the permanent establishment. So in the law, there are specific inclusions for which all these tests which I just explained will need to be satisfied. So those are like, place of management, branch, office, or a workshop, any land building or any other form of real estate property, or any installation structures for the extraction of renewable or non-renewable natural resources, any mine, oil and gas well, or any vessels which are used for extraction, or even any building or construction site or any assembly or installation project which exists for more than 6 months in a 12-month period.
Can you elaborate more on the place of management?
Okay. So like one of the specific inclusions which I mentioned for a fixed place permanent establishment is a place of management. So what is a place of management? Where basically the management decisions are taken place, where the day-to-day business decisions which are important for the functioning of the business are taken place, where there is direction, supervision, management functions are performed. So that is considered as a place of management. So the management what we are referring to here is actually the internal management and not any kind of management services which could be performed for other companies.
So your last point regarding the inclusions, you described about the building site, construction project, and assembly or installation project. So can you explain these in detail?
Okay. So any building site or construction site or any assembly or installation project could also trigger a permanent establishment in the UAE if those project exist for more than 6 months period in a calendar year basically. This construction need not be construction of buildings only. It can be project for construction of canals, roads, or even renovation of the buildings or any laying of any pipelines, etc. Those could also trigger a permanent establishment. One important point to note here is that when we are talking about this 6 months period, we need to see that the period which is before the corporate tax became applicable will not be considered. So the period which is basically starting from the first tax period of the non-resident person will be counted towards the calculation of this 6-month period. So for example, if there is a project which let's say starts from March 23 and ends September 23, and the non-resident has a tax period from, let's say, July to June. So only the period from July 2023 to September 2023 will be counted towards the calculation of this 6-month period.
Okay. So how do you describe the term preparatory or auxiliary activities?
Okay, like I mentioned that one of the tests which need to be satisfied for a fixed place PE is a business activity test. So those business activities should be core income generating activities of the non-resident person and should not be just preparatory or auxiliary. So preparatory activities can be those which precede the commencement of the core income generating activity and which support the core income generating activity. And auxiliary activities could be such which support the functions of the enterprise but are not the main part of the business of the enterprise through which the company is generating the revenue. So that's not the main activity of the enterprise. So various activities which could be preparatory or auxiliary in nature will not create a permanent establishment. So for example, if there is storage or delivery of the goods of the non-resident person in UAE, can be considered as only or it was just a display of the goods. So this can be an auxiliary activity. However, if that storage or delivery or the warehousing is part of the main sale and distribution business of the company, then it need not be an auxiliary activity and it can be a main activity. So there has to be a careful consideration to check whether that activity will qualify as a preparatory or auxiliary or not. So keeping any goods of the non-resident person for the sole purpose of processing by another person will be an auxiliary activity. Or if there is any purchase of goods or collecting information for the non-resident person, which again is not the main service which the non-resident is providing or is not generating any revenue from that particular service, will be an auxiliary activity or any other similar activities of such nature.
What are the additional exclusions related to fixed place permanent establishment?
Okay, so there are some exclusions where a natural non-resident person will not create a permanent establishment. So if a natural person is present in the UAE due to unexceptional circumstances which are beyond his or her control and which took place while he was already present in the UAE. So for example, any travel restrictions imposed where he could not travel outside of the UAE, or any acts of war or any natural disasters or any occurrence of any emergency health conditions. So in that case, it would not trigger a permanent establishment. If there are employees of the employed by the non-resident person which do not conduct core income generating activities and do not derive state sourced income, then these would also not create a permanent establishment. So these are some of the exclusions from the permanent establishment.
Okay. So now we come to the other form of permanent establishment, agency permanent establishment. So what do you mean by that and how is it determined?
So basically, if a non-resident person does not have a fixed or permanent place of business in the UAE, it could still create a permanent establishment by way of an agency PE. So if there is an agent in the UAE, which can be either a natural person or a juridical person or even a resident person or a non-resident person, which conducts business or business activity on behalf of the non-resident person. So agency PE would arise if that person, that agent, habitually concludes or negotiates contracts on behalf of the non-resident person in UAE. When we say the word habitually, it actually means which are done on a regular or recurrent, repeated basis and not just mere isolated cases. So let me give you an example here. So for example, there is a non-resident company which sells products in various countries around the world. And for their Middle East distribution, they have appointed an agent who works exclusively for the non-resident person in UAE. So what that agent does, it contacts various customers in the UAE, convinces them to buy those products, even negotiates various terms with the customers, like the prices, the delivery terms, the payment terms, etc. And once everything is agreed with the customer, it passes the lead to the non-resident person to conclude those contracts. So in this case, the conclusion of the contracts is done by the non-resident person, but the negotiation activity is actually done by the dependent agent, which is in UAE. So in this case, the permanent establishment would attract. Another thing which can be checked here is if there is a double taxation avoidance agreement between UAE and the country of the non-resident person, to see whether same agency PE condition would trigger in the DTA or not. Because there is a possibility that in the double taxation avoidance agreement, agency PE is only triggered when there is conclusion of contracts. However, in this example which we are talking about, it's only the negotiation activity. So if the DTA has some other article for the agency PE, then we have to consider that to see whether an agency PE would attract or not. Another important point we need to consider here is that for agency PE, we need to have a substance over form approach. So for example, even though the contracts are not done in the name of the non-resident, but obligation to perform is actually on the non-resident, that could also attract an agency PE in the UAE.
So with that said, we come to an end to today's episode of CT Talks with Premier Brains. I'd like to thank Ms. Bhavna for her knowledge and guidance she has provided to our viewers. We hope today's session was enlightening and provided a clear guidance into who are considered non-residents for UAE corporate tax, the registration requirements you would be required to go through, and how a permanent establishment is determined and the different forms of permanent establishment that are related to a non-resident person. Stay tuned for our next episode where we'll bring you another interesting topic about UAE corporate tax. Until then, thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you so much, everyone.